Hi, everybody. As you're all kind of coming in, we'll just wait about 20 seconds or so, wait for everybody to join on this lovely evening, wherever you are tuning in from for this Oceans in Crisis webinar. Okay. So let's kick off and we'll get going reasonably slowly in this first minute or two, waiting for people to join. We've had a lot of great interest in this webinar, Oceans in Crisis, an urgent call for increased protection. Firstly, I want to thank you so much for joining us. Of course, want to acknowledge that we are all zooming in from Aboriginal land, stolen land, land that was never ceded. I'm here in Redfern, which is Gadigal land. Feel free to pop into the chat where you're zooming in from. And I know for some of these things, we get international guests as well. People are zooming in from outside Australia, which is also very exciting. So let us know where you're tuning in from. It's an active chat if you want to have discussions in there. So very excited about tonight. We have an incredible group of leading marine scientists and campaigners to talk to us tonight about what the hell is going on when it comes to marine protection in New South Wales and Australia and globally. And locally, actually, and what we can do, what steps we can take immediately and over the next few months to get that increased protection that we know is so important for our beautiful marine life. I'll just tell a really quick story. In fact, why don't we, everybody can turn their videos off now, or on, I should say, in terms of the speakers. Come and join me and I'll introduce all you lovely folk in a second. Yes, amazing. David, Emma, Gary, and Dane, who I'll introduce in a second, but a very quick, lovely story. I went snorkeling on the weekend just off Bondi, Ben Buckler Headland, absolutely ridiculous, beautiful. We're just talking about how warm the water is, though, which is a little bit concerning, as we know. But just looked down and there underneath me was this beautiful, like, I reckon it was 1.4 meters or something, 1.5 meters, this beautiful wobbegong shark just cruising along under us. And David and I were just talking as well. David's just been in the water today with his students and seahorses and so many beautiful creatures, both in Sydney and, of course, right through New South Wales waters. So I love the ocean. I love the marine environment. I know so many people do. We saw that with the awful killing of Gus the Groper, which is an extraordinary reaction, which we'll talk about. We'll talk about the politics of that as well. And what we can do to get increased protection based on what we know is this obscene, this not obscene, beautiful, but very widespread love of our ocean. So let's get right stuck into it because I want to get into these presentations. So thank you everybody for saying hi and where you are coming from. It's amazing. Okay, first up, we have, and I'm just going to do a quick introduction of everybody so you know who's here. But first up, we're going to have Professor David Booth, Professor of Marine Ecology in the UTS School of Life Sciences and the team leader of Fish Ecology Lab, which undertakes innovative research of the sustainability of the oceans and fish populations. He's published more than 180 papers. I haven't read every one of them, David, about reef fish ecology, climate change, and other anthropogenic impacts on fishes and fisheries globally. David was an Australian Research Council postdoctoral fellow at the Australian Institute of Marine Science, a visiting professor at the University of the Virgin Islands. He served the research community as president of the Australian Coral Reef Society and as chair of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the Sydney Institute of Marine Science. Says he knows his stuff. Next, we have Gary Dunnett, New South Wales National Parks Association Executive Director. Gary is a specialist in protected area management and planning. He believes marine protected areas have suffered far more neglect and abuse than any other part of our state's network of conservation reserves, which is true, which is pretty shocking, actually, saying that. Tonight, Gary will be talking about the aquatic reserve system in New South Wales. Emma Doyle, member of the New South Wales Sanctuary Alliance Steering Group. Emma is on steering committees for the United Nations Environment Program, the International Coral Reef Conservation Initiative, and the Mesoamerican Reef Fund. She's a board member of several Caribbean regional fisheries and conservation NGOs. And tonight, Emma will compare current trends in New South Wales marine conservation to efforts happening globally. Really interesting. And finally, Dane Wilmot, who is president of the Nature Coast Marine Group. And Dane is on the New South Wales South Coast. He's also a spearfisher who sees firsthand the values of marine protection. And Dane will speak to us about what's happening in Bateman's Bay Marine Park. We know there's not enough protection, which we'll talk about. So let's jump straight into it. We're going to go to David Booth first, who's going to give us a great overview of what's happening in New South Wales. Over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Kate, and thanks to Kate and team for organising today's webinar. Should I do our share screen playing? Yeah, wait till I find my there. Is that seen by folk? Or yeah, there's nothing more
that's
embarrassing
great. Perfect.
than
Thanks,
chatting
David.
away for a while and then you realise no one can see what you're looking at. So I just want to spend a few minutes today talking about my musings, I guess you'd call them. I'm a scientist. I'm not a politician. I'm not very savvy in legislation or anything like that, but I do have a bit of an understanding of what's going on in the marine environment in terms of fish populations, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to talk a little bit today about my mantra, which is if we're going to preserve, we need no-take sanctuary zones. They are the gold standard for marine conservation in New South Wales, and we have very little of them at the moment. So I'll get right into it. So Emma, I guess we'll talk more about this. The world scene is not good. Only a very tiny fraction of the oceans is in this no-take situation where we don't have mining, we don't have fishing, either recreational, commercial. And these areas are required basically to replenish the rest of the ocean, not just to conserve and preserve within their bounds. So it's well known that around about 30% of the ocean in the correct arrangement should be preserved to allow at least the replenishment of the rest of the ocean that is being depleted. And we've got less than 2%, so nothing to be too proud of here. But backing up before we get too negative, in New South Wales, we have a magnificent ocean seascape, the coast and offshore, and Kate mentioned her wonderful story, but we have, for instance, even Sydney Harbour has over 600 species of fish, which is more than the coasts of Europe. So we've got lots to be proud of and lots to look after. So it's, I guess the message there, it ain't too late. But we do have pressures, even though other places are worse. We do have pollution, for instance, especially on our coastal waters, whether they be plastics or organic pollutions or whatever. And we especially see those around urban areas, of course, but they are quite widespread. So there's these sorts of things that we need to take account of. Climate change, everyone knows the issues there, and the reef at the moment is in a horrible bleaching situation. We'll be going up there with students in a few weeks and ready to be a bit shocked at what's going on. But we don't escape the effects of climate change in New South Wales. East Coast low storms like the one at the bottom there washed up over 200 of these magnificent weedy sea dragons that we worked on actually the year before last, due to this East Coast low climate change phenomenon. So these sorts of things are happening. And human pressures direct pressures such as fishing. So whether it be taking undersized fish, anchoring and causing anchor scars in seagrass beds, recreational, commercial. The one up the top left, I don't know if it'll play, but it's basically our coming across a small blind shark caught on a line, which luckily we came along, otherwise it would have been swimming round and round until it met its demise. So all these things are happening because we're in the ocean and disturbing it in some capacity or go away. And we do know also through Australia-wide data that fish supplies are on the skids. They're going down quite remarkably. And this particular paper I'm referring to here showed that in a decade, fairly recently, they dropped about 30%. And that's in a country that boasts, probably correctly, some of the world's best fisheries management. So fisheries management is not what it's all about. We need parts of the ocean to be left alone. So last year, we published a report sponsored by Australian Marine Conservation Society that tried to address this and also show the evidence that these no-take zones are the way to go. And We then, I guess, peddled it around a bit. It's still available on the website, and talked to various politicians, including Kate. It was nice to see the bipartisan, tripartisan, polypartisan support that we seem to be getting. We ran a marine forum afterwards at UTS. And so there was really a lot of goodwill and interest. But of course, that doesn't translate to action just yet. And so with Christmas coming, with Christmas in between, we seem to have lost some momentum, but it's good to hear we're getting it back a bit. And so that report, one of the things it showed was some of the work like the following. So what we find is we see a huge drop in fish stocks, maybe 30%, but not in marine reserves. So the green there represents the lack of dropping in marine reserves, but in the red represents the dropping of fish populations outside reserves. The grey in the middle is where you allow certain sorts of fishing and not others. So the clear message is any fishing can affect fish stocks, and that marine reserves, by virtue of lack of that, can preserve them. Pretty clear. And there's lots of evidence. And New South Wales, it turns out, is one of the world leaders in this fish work. We've published some papers, but most of the papers, believe it or not, come from DPI fisheries scientists. These are world experts. The thing that I find disappointing is a couple of levels above them, the message seems to be lost. And I'll get back to that a bit later. So the work is here, the evidence is here, right for our own state, that no-take marine reserves are the way to go. How many of these are there? Well, in the Commonwealth, we're a bit under 10%, which is, again, only a third of what we're aiming for. But if you look at state by state, we look pretty good in that table, but 7% is not much at all. 7% of our coasts where you cannot fish, 93% is open to fishing. It's clearly not enough. In Sydney, the situation's even worse. So we have this amazing place. We have climate change impacts. Over 20% of the wreck fishes in New South Wales, in Australia, over 600 species, only about over 1% is in no-take reserves. It's just ridiculous. Places like the following, if anyone knows where this is Cabbage Tree Bay, Manly's at the top, and we're inside the north head of Sydney Harbour. The blue hatched area is an aquatic reserve, which is great. However, you can fish in the aquatic reserve, so it's of limited value. The little reserve, Cabbage Tree Bay, above that, that's a great example of how a no-take reserve, even a small one, can preserve fish populations, and that's what we're aiming for. So there are the aquatic reserves there, and only one of them is no-take for fishing. And evidence in this beautiful Cabbage Tree Bay that the fish stocks, particularly fish species like mowong and luderick and bream, are higher in abundance. And it's quite striking if you ever go swimming there and then you swim out of the reserve. So they work. They punch above their weight. The other thing that I just wanted to mention is single reserves are fine, but fish have this bad habit of dispersing, and there's little Nemo there, and it's not far from the truth. And so we have a longshore dispersal. So fishes have babies, the babies move. So it's not good enough just to preserve one area. You've got to preserve a network. That's an important message to get across. Outside these small no-take areas, as I've already said, there's a thing called a spillover effect. So fishes and others can benefit by larger fish getting out of the reserves, or the extra eggs produced in the reserve spilling out outside. That's been well established genetically now. We know that. Lots of scientific evidence, and our report details the many dozens and dozens of papers showing this for different organisms. And our recommendations, I won't go through them all now, but some of the main ones were, and a big one, I still believe this strongly, is relocating Marine Park Authority and the marine parks to the Department of Environment under Penny Sharp. And I won't even go through the stories I've been told about the mismanagement that happens above the level of scientists, I'd have to say, in marine parks. Clearly, there's a conflict between the need for fisheries and the need for marine protection within that department. And so we'd like to see that moved. Sadly, in the last 10 years, they've actually removed protection rather than given it. So the Bateman's area, Dane know all about this. Overnight, protection was removed and it still hasn't come back. So that should be brought back. There needs to be more education, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the interesting things, and so I produced a little a paper, this is not it, but that lists the various myths you hear about marine parks and their lack of operation, and for people to look at to see that a lot of these myths are just that, they're myths. Lots and lots of, we're almost undergoing submission fatigue within the marine science community for these sorts of things. And we were quite hit in the guts, I guess you'd call it, when the Sydney Marine Park was turned back. So that's still on the cards. It's a gaping hole in the marine park system, we feel. Lots of submissions. I won't look at all those, but there's plenty of them. And just as a final note, another initiative is taking place now. We do want these big marine protected areas, but also small ones work as Coventry Bay. This is an example at Monavale, Bongan Marine Reserve, and there's a huge groundswell of interest in preserving this area and a few others like Parsley Bay in the harbour in the Sydney area, with great local support, but of course the usual opposition. So we're really pushing these sorts of things as a beachhead, a way to get people to understand the value of no-take areas and maybe expand it further.
Thanks, David.
That's it.
Oh, that's it.
Done. Right on time. Good.
Stop sharing. Thank you.
Stop sharing.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yes, so much work over so many years trying to demonstrate the worth and demonstrating very, very ably and competently the worth of protecting more of our oceans in sanctuary zones, no-take zones where fishing cannot take place. I've noticed somebody's put their hand up, but we won't be taking questions at this point. And I did fail to mention that there is the Q&A box. That's the kind of very quick way to manage questions at the end of all the speakers. So what we'll do is jump straight into hearing from Gary now. And Gary, as I said, is going to be talking to us about the very, very complicated, complex, ridiculous world of aquatic reserves in New South Wales. Gary.
Thanks, Kate. And look, I'd like to also start by just acknowledging that we're meeting on Aboriginal lands, various and seas for that matter. I'm actually going to start off outside of the water and just, I guess, NPA is really interested in the whole of our reserve system. So, you know, everything from national parks to aquatic reserves. And if we think about the terrestrial space, we've sort of got big and small reserves. We've got big national parks, which are entire landscapes, and then we have these nature reserves, which are predominantly areas of really high conservation value, but they tend to be smaller and more compact. There might be just a single ecosystem or a single catchment. And in the marine space, we've got a not dissimilar situation. We've got big marine parks, and then we've got this string of very small aquatic reserves. And if we go to the legislation, you know, the rules, if you like, for why you have these places, what we see that in the case of aquatic reserves, we've got purposes of aquatic reserves, which are all about their primary purpose is to conserve biological diversity or particular components of diversity, such as specific ecosystems in a specified area of the marine estate. And it's not that dissimilar to what we've got with nature reserves. Now, the reason I start with that is that in fact, nature reserves are widely recognised as the jewels in our conservation crown in the terrestrial space. And unfortunately, aquatic reserves aren't. They're in a really different situation. And what I want to run through tonight is why they're so different. But if we just start at the sort of the macro level, you can see that we've got 6 marine parks and 12 aquatic reserves. So there's twice as many aquatic reserves as marine parks. But in fact, their total area is tiny. It's only just over 2,000 hectares. And in fact, of that 2,000 hectares, 1,400 hectares is occupied by Tara Point Aquatic Reserve, just one of them. The rest of them all sort of sit there at about 30 to 50 hectares in extent. It's also worth noting that it is creating marine reserves is a really politicised thing. If you actually look at the data of when the reserves were created, all of our aquatic reserves, marine parks and aquatic reserves were created under Labor governments. Not a single one was created under a coalition government. That's quite different when you go to the terrestrial reserves. You know, the coalition creates reserves, not at the same rate as Labor governments historically, but nonetheless they create them. But we've got a much starker situation when it comes to marine conservation. So David's just put up this map of where the aquatic reserves are throughout New South Wales. And what you can see is that with the exception of bushrangers down on the south coast and the Cook Islands Reserve, the rest of them are essentially on the Sydney coastline. So they're literally between Barrenjoey Headland and then down Shiprock on the Hacking.
Gary, can I jump in? Are you able to see if you can do full screen with your
Let me just see.
able, just because it's easier to see your maps if that's not too
How's that?
much better. Thank you.
Apologies for that. Okay, so as you can see, this is your 12 aquatic reserves. Towra is outstanding in terms of its size, but the rest of them are small. So we might ask ourselves, well, are they actually doing anything? And that question is really complicated by the fact that unlike our national parks and our nature reserves, where you've got consistent rules to how conservation values are going to be maintained, you've got anything but consistency when it comes to these aquatic reserves. So we've got a cluster of 5 of them, Barrenjoey all the way down to Narrabeen and Cape Banks, where you can actually take a range of species, in this case, rock lobster, southern rock lobster, abalone, and some of the aquatic plants from those reserves. What you can't do is take a lot of the invertebrates that communities from a Mediterranean or an islander background often collect on rocky reefs, but you can take those other species. You've then got places like Longreef, North Harbour, parts of Towra and Cook Island, where you can actually fish. You know, you can extract fish provided you're using either a spear gun in most cases or handheld lines. And then we've got just that little trio where they are genuine sanctuaries, and those are bushrangers, which is down in the Shoalhaven, Cabbage Tree, Manly, Shiprock on the Hacking, and in fact a portion of Towra Point. So of the 12, only at best 4 of them are actually operating at sanctuaries. In the rest of them, you can actually still extract resources. And when you think about that, that's sort of, it's quite a strange situation, because the species that people are allowed to take are precisely the species which are most heavily, extracted from the adjoining unlimited waters. So you've created a conservation reserve where you're not actually protecting the species which are most exploited more broadly across the state, which is quite a strange setup. So again, this is just reflecting the bizarre range of activities that are permitted within these aquatic reserves. So for the most part, they're not actually operating as conservation reserves. The legislation promises much, but the reality is really different. We then go to, okay, well, gee, it's a bit fuzzy in terms of what's actually being achieved out of legislation, but of course, a key part of conservation management is actually having plans of management that say, this is how we're going to look after this place. This is how we're going to secure it. And again, the Marine Estate Management Plan Act is not that bad in the way it describes what the management plans need to do. But unfortunately, it's got this extraordinary get out of jail clause when it comes to aquatic reserves. It basically says you can produce an aquatic management plan for aquatic reserve, but you don't have to. So that's a bit weird. You then ask yourself, well, how many aquatic reserves actually have conservation management plans? And unfortunately, the answer is a big fat 0. Now, it's really hard to conceive of how you do conservation management if you don't actually know what you're managing for. You know, I don't think anyone would think that any part of our terrestrial reserve system, we just fly blind. And yet that's what's expected with our aquatic reserves. So I don't want to leave you tonight with the idea that this is, you know, it's all bad when it comes to aquatic reserves. And I think if we just take a moment to look at the 4 that are actually genuine no-take, there's some points for being somewhat positive about what might be achieved with these. So Towra is actually part of Botany Bay, and you can see it's actually this extraordinary mix of salt marsh, of mangrove systems, of seagrass systems, both Posidonia down in the deeper water and Zostera in the shallower water. It's an extraordinary place which half of it operates as genuine sanctuary, the rest of it as a general, they call it a sanctuary, but it's actually not a sanctuary. It's only the refuge zone which is operating as a sanctuary. But it's a really special place. You know, it's, as I say, it's this mix of the salt marsh and the mangroves. It's incredibly important for a suite of migratory species. In this case, this is a juvenile little tern, one of the crazy animals that flies between the two ends of the world so that it essentially gets a perpetual summer. And they're only able to subsist in the Australian end because of places like Tara. And these are a pair of grey-tailed tattler, another one of these migratory species that in their case, they spend most of their time within the mangroves. We then go to one of the other Sydney ones, which is a genuine no-take reserve, which David mentioned, Cabbage Tree Bay, and it's one of the few places where you can get this sort of interaction. So this is a little dusky whaler, and because he's so close to me, he looks big, but or she looks big rather. But you know, ocean swimmer above. It took me about 3 years to actually line up that shot. I was very pleased with it when it finally happened. And then my very favourite conservation reserve in New South Wales, which is the Shiprock Aquatic Reserve. It's just a brilliant, brilliant place, and yet it's tiny, 0.6 hectares. It's totally covered in this fantastic coral, which gets encrusted by a symbiotic sponge. This is a little morning cuttlefish.
1 minute, Gary.
Yep, beauty, black cod, an incredible range of tropical species like these blue-barred orange parrotfish. And then we go down to Bushrangers Bay, which is the other no-take, which in recent years has actually become an extraordinary aggregation site for grey nurse sharks. So where do we go with aquatic reserves? Like, the rules and regulations are all over the place. They're very concentrated in Sydney. They don't have management plans, which sort of really questions whether government is treating them seriously as protected areas. They've got okay legislation around them. The species that they're not protecting are those that are most under stress elsewhere. And so it's sort of analogous to having nature reserves where you're allowed to go hunting koalas and greater gliders. It's an extraordinary situation. But despite all these problems, these little reserves offer perhaps the best opportunity to conserve relatively small areas of high conservation significance in a similar fashion to our nature reserves. And frankly, if we can't get it right for such tiny parts of our ocean, how are we possibly going to get it right for the broader marine estate? So what we're suggesting, and it's reflected in the report that David alluded to earlier that he authored, is that we need to lift the status of all of our aquatic reserves, just those 12, to full sanctuary. It's a small step, but it's a step that's going to show the community that the wheels don't fall off if you actually dare to conserve marine species. And it's a step that will ultimately lead us to a broader, more resilient marine protected area network. Thanks, Kate.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Gary. That was a great overview. And I have to say, I spoke to Gary, got this kind of similar presentation a couple of months ago, and was shocked myself at the complexity of the aquatic reserves. Had no idea that they had such different levels of take. I think that's super interesting and important to get out, because yes, the bare minimum is to ensure those aquatic reserves are protected, but we will be also calling for more things, which are some of our, when we get to Dane, he will tell you about some other campaign, another ask that we're also asking for in terms of Bateman's Bay. Let's move to Emma now, if you're there, Emma, and we'll go straight to you to get this kind of comparison of how we're faring to the rest of the world. Take it away.
Okay, perfect. Hopefully you can see my screen and hear me okay.
Not on that full screen. If
there we go. Okay, so thanks, Kate, and good evening, everyone. Let's take a look at what's happening internationally in terms of marine conservation and best marine management practices. My full-time job is actually coordinating a network of marine protected areas called MPA Connect, and it's in the Caribbean region with support from NOAA in the US and other international partners. So I'm going to draw, there's 18 countries and territories I work with, and I'm going to draw on some photos from there. This is actually a photo of the premier marine park in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And it's kind of small. It's only 65 square kilometres, which is actually pretty big, I guess, compared to New South Wales. But it's a key asset there for tourism, the national tourism economy. It's also mostly no-take zone, protecting some critical reefs that you can see there and fish nursery habitat. Now, David Booth alluded to the concept of networking, and one of the strengths of that site is that it's networked with a system of marine protected areas in the Grenadines, and also it's part of our regional networking. Now, this concept is huge internationally. It's a big trend globally to network marine protected areas to build effective management, because small, unconnected areas with partial protection and poor enforcement aren't effective. So now we're seeing that international donors, impact investors, accelerator programs, and site-specific sustainable financing is all coming together to support efforts to build capacity for management among these different marine parks, to share experience among the managers and to network them with each other and with experts and with other partners. Now, MPA Connect isn't alone in this. In fact, in the Pacific region, there's another network of marine protected areas called PIMPAC. There's the Coral Triangle Centre in Bali. There's MedPan in the Mediterranean. WIOMSA is in the Western Indian Ocean, just to name a few. The international support for the implementation of effective marine protected areas and their management is really a direct response to the national commitments that our governments have taken under various multilateral environment agreements and in their own constitutions and national legislation. Now, there are many agreements related to MPAs to mention. David mentioned one of them. There are agreements that enshrine principles for sustainability. Since the earliest days, 1982 UNCLOS and the Law of the Sea speaks to sustainable management of marine natural resources. The more recent UNDP Sustainable Development Goals, especially SDG 14, there's the Commonwealth Blue Charter. Then there are the other agreements that have the quantitative targets, like the Convention on Biodiversity and the Aichi targets. Then there's the International Union for the Conservation of Nature with the targets for 30% coverage by 2030. The first time I heard that 30% target was actually in Sydney at the Excellent World Parks Congress that was held at Homebush. And there was a big move for 50%, half for nature. But the recommendation and the formal recommendation was for 30%, and this is being taken up around the world. The key takeout from all of these agreements, and I'm not going to bore you and present them, but the key takeout is that marine protection, marine protected areas are a proven tool in fisheries management, and they're a way through which we can realise the ocean's promise of food security and sustainable livelihoods. Now, globally, we're seeing recognition that establishing and investing in marine protection and management pays dividends for sustainable futures, that marine protected areas are nature-based solutions to societal and environmental challenges like climate change. They're a way to build social and environmental resilience. They're really pillars of the blue economy because they can drive new opportunities for investment in blue enterprise development. That's a real keyword currently globally. In the case of New South Wales, I think it's really important to recognise that marine protected areas, this idea of an area closure, I'd never heard the term of a lockout used in the area that I work, but the protected areas are just one tool among many that we can apply for best fisheries management. We're all accustomed to the idea of having a license, of a minimum size, of the idea that you protect key predators like sharks, or that you have a ban on taking the slow maturing, the slow to breed, the critically important ecological species like the grouper. So MPAs are just one among those. There's really no reason for the polarization over this one concept among all these in fisheries management. Now, marine and fisheries management isn't all that marine parks do. I want to stress that. There's so much more than fisheries management. If you look at all these icons on the screen, these are like 20 different areas that the managers of marine parks work on. You can see among those that there's livelihoods, there's outreach and education, that there's support from the private sector, that there's management of many different forms, and opportunities for cost sharing and for benefit sharing, and also for private sector for support and for these to be community driven. Now, the lack of marine parks in New South Wales effective and a system of marine parks means that New South Wales is missing out on valuable opportunities for building local stewardship through youth education and community liaison. Marine parks in the rest of the world are actively engaging with youth and with Indigenous people to build engaged and empowered and resourceful communities who are the best possible stewards for sustainable seas. We're missing opportunities to work with scientists, with experts, citizen science. We're missing the opportunity to engage fishers and the dive sector fully in co-management of protected areas. This is another trend that's really important globally, co-management of marine protected areas by governments, with community groups, with multiple specialist partner agencies, according to formal agreements. We see this, for example, in Belize, where NGOs, non-profits, have formal co-management agreements with the Fisheries Division to do enforcement. The NGOs are uniquely able to raise sustainable financing. They work on research and they work on the catch quotas with government that are enforced, and do this in consultation with fishers. In Hawaii, there are community groups that work on and lead education and building compliance. There is a sense of urgency across the world in marine conservation. We see this in those of multilateral agreements, but we're also seeing that coastal communities are really depending on our response, where the global community in the marine world is responding by focusing on financing for the implementation of effective marine parks, looking at the most effective design with simple boundaries, simple regulations, simple bylaws that are enforceable and that are easy to understand, and marine protected areas that are firmly based on community participation and community consultation, and even co-management with community groups, who in New South Wales are obviously showing great readiness for this. But unlike in other parts of the world, there is sometimes a disconnect between these different levels at the highest levels of government and readiness on the ground. So, following the efforts of many to establish solid marine spatial planning in the past.
1 minute.
I was going to say the need is just to work together to catch up on conservation and sustainable development at the state level, jointly in support of effective management of our marine areas. Thanks, Kate.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Emma. Fantastic. Okay, let's now kind of bringing all this home. We've got Dane, who is kind of, I suppose, on the front line of a community that has seen horrendous attacks basically on what were sanctuary zones and no-take zones in an existing marine park, and quite a strong campaign for a number of years down there. Dane, I'm sure you'll give everybody a bit of a history of that, and we can talk about the politics going forward. So over to you, Dane, in terms of what's happening down the South Coast, and what are you wanting to see in terms of change?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. So yeah, I live in Narooma on the South Coast, and the Batemans Marine Park is adjacent to Narooma. And in 2019, we had 6 of our sanctuary zones subject to an amnesty. So in this process, which I want to make clear, the minister has no powers under the regulations to implement an amnesty. This was done through a media release. So in effect, the sanctuary zones still exist. They're there. And the reason for the amnesty is to be in place so that fishers can fish in these sanctuary zones free of prosecution. So it's a farcical stunt that was pulled by the Liberal National Government back in 2019 after some heavy lobbying from REC and commercial fishing lobbyists. And it's remained in place despite the change of government. So we've written letters, of course, to local members and had meetings with Tara Moriarty, the Minister for Agriculture, and asked the question, how is this still the case? You're following a Liberal National Government policy. You're a Labor government. This just makes no sense whatsoever. So as our other speakers have identified, if you're reading between the lines, you'll really identify that there's 2 types of protection: sanctuary zones and nothing. Okay, I want to make that very clear. There is no in between. The marine science that comes out of these great fishery scientists from DPI can show that there is virtually no benefits at all to a habitat protection zone or a general use zone The only benefits really come from full no-take sanctuary zones. As a fisher, I've seen it, the benefits of this. I lived in Manly when I was a young man, and I used to go and catch squid off the wharf there at Cabbage Tree Bay when you could still fish there. I used to dive in and get my jigs when I'd lose them. Now, 20 years later, now that's become fully no-take. I can see the difference with my own eyes. It's stark. It was very obvious when I dived there in my early 20s. This was a place that was heavily fished, and it's very, very different now. So I'd like to just speak a bit on those aquatic reserves. While they are very good as engagement tools for the community, they are invaluable in that sense. They're not as good overall for the scientists, these DPI fishery scientists, to be able to prove the benefits of spillover. So in order for them to do the DNA tracking and stuff that they do, they need decent sample sizes. So that's why I'm going to ask everyone here to zoom out and really think big picture here. We've had incredible pressures, as many of you I'm sure know, on our marine resources or marine biodiversity through industrialization. So we're no longer in a situation where it's just okay to be sustainable. Sustainability doesn't work because our baselines have shifted so far. We need to regenerate our fish stocks. We need to regenerate our food systems. So sanctuary zones are the most effective way to do this. It's proven. Large fish spawn more eggs. More eggs mean more juveniles. They spill over and they restock the fish. Now, it makes sense to everyone here, probably all this information. Why are we in this situation? How is it that we still get pushed back? And I think about this quite often as a fisher, because there are a small minority, and I would like to point that out, that there are many like me, identify as fishers that are in support of sanctuary zones. However, there are a small, very vocal minority that think if you're going to take their rights away in terms of fishing, you're effectively taking away their firstborn child. So I think about this often. How do we counter some of this extreme argument to say that there are other mechanisms to manage fisheries, such as bag limits and spatial differences, etc.? And a lot of them will say that they do recognise and listen to the science. But with any scientific study, there needs to be a baseline. And in the marine space, that baseline is a sanctuary zone. If we were to do a medical trial and we gave the people doing the trial 2 placebos, it wouldn't be a medical trial. So I'd like to encourage everybody moving forward to, if you ever do come across a fisher that has this staunch opinion, ask them the question. You say that you are a responsible fisher and you manage your fish stocks effectively. How do you know? How do we know? We don't. It's impossible. Without a sanctuary zone to compare what the effects on fishing are on the stocks, compared to a sanctuary zone, there is no science, there is no study, there is no comparison. So they're absolutely essential to manage fisheries moving forward. And anyone that opposes it is just blatantly being irresponsible. So that's about all I've got to say on that. I'm not very technical. I'm not a scientist. I'm a firefighter. And that's how I stand on things.
Yes, amazing. Thank you. Excellent, honestly. A great summary. I reckon over the past few years, to be honest, there has been, a lot of really great kind of campaigns, environmental campaigns, also marine conservation campaigns. What I have seen is I think everybody was thinking that when Labor got in, that we'd start seeing some movement, and all of the work that all of you have done, Gary, Dane, David, Emma, trying to build awareness around conservation, that we were going to see Labor come in and start, bringing it home, to be honest, and starting to restore those sanctuary zones that the National Party just completely took a wrecking ball to. So that hasn't happened. It's been a year just to get blatantly political, because I can't do one of these without getting blatantly political. And this is a political decision, obviously. That hasn't happened. So I've been speaking with a bunch of people in the marine conservation space over, the last little while to say, I think we just need to really ramp stuff up now and really let Labor, the New South Wales government, know how much we care about our oceans and just how much we want them protected. Dane's kind of got this low-hanging fruit, if you like. You would think even Gary's presented the aquatic reserves. You think that that would be kind of relatively simple. However, in terms of what Dane has been talking about, the National Party, you know, back in with Andrew Constance and Adam Marshall, back before the last election even, wasn't it, Dane? 2019 or just after, maybe just before, yeah. They just decided in this absolutely blatant political National Party move to say, hey, everybody, just go and fish in these beautiful no-take sanctuary zones that, you know, with all of the build-up of marine life and everything that you get in sanctuary zones, just go and fish and we won't implement the law. So basically, that's been happening the entire time now. Labor's gotten in. I met with the minister, as Dane said, he met with the minister, others have, and it's just like, what the hell? This is like the lowest hanging fruit that you've got. Surely you know this happened, don't you? And that it was a National Party thing and Labor's got a reasonably okay record on marine park conservation. Nah, nothing. Plus the other really big political decision that happened that, again, just in terms of any conversations that you're having with Labor, and what I can see people have got questions in the Q&A we'll get to in a sec. The other really big critical thing that Labor hasn't done, which just speaks volumes for where they're sitting at with marine conservation, which David mentioned, is they haven't moved responsibility for fisheries, for marine park management, sorry, I should say, back to the Environment Department overall. That has always happened in Labor. National Party got in 2011. Barry O'Farrell, one of the first things that he did, and this politics is really important to understand, one of the first things that he did was they moved marine conservation, marine park management to the National Party, right? Because they just wanted to, it's a resource to exploit, we want to make the fishers happy or whatever, and it's a political decision, we hate conservation. That's the National Party. So waited, and they're attacking sanctuary zones and allowing fishing and winding back stuff that Labor spent quite a number of years consulting on. So, you know, Labor gets in and we expect them to immediately do that. And they didn't. We expected them to immediately, when they allocated the acts and the ministers, to once again ensure that marine parks were under the dominant minister. There was the Environment Minister and not Fisheries and Agriculture. They haven't done it. And we've lobbied, I've asked questions in budget estimates, written to Penny Sharp, the Premier. So this is serious. This is actually really serious. We've got a Labor government who are normally really pretty good. You know, of course, we're the Greens. We would want them to do much more, but they're not too bad and they get it historically at the national level and in different, and so has former Liberal governments, actually, just to be fair, as well at the federal level, Robert Hill, in terms of federal marine park stuff. So the politics are that Labor doesn't think that this is an issue for them. They think they can get away with it. Chris Minns doesn't. It's just not on their radar. So we'll go to the questions. I know some people are talking about, asking about campaigns. We'll get to that at the end. We've still got about 10 minutes or so for questions. We could talk about campaigns. So we could talk, I want to, here we go. So Gary has asked about, this is a political kind of campaign discussion as well, but you know, people are really keen around the 30 by 30 campaign. We have seen at the state and federal level, Labor has talked about that in terms of terrestrial parks. I think it's a policy, in fact. 30 by 30 in New South Wales, particularly, of course, with climate change, which is impacting our waters probably more here than anywhere else in the country, if not globally. There's this really full-on red hotspot off New South Wales coast. It's really concerning. Strategies for 30 by 30. Gary, do you have any thoughts on this? I might go to you because I think NPA has been kind of pretty active in this space.
Yeah, I think what we, just in the same way, Kate, that you were talking about the lack of action on restoring the damage that was done under the previous government, what we're seeing is an extraordinary laziness in New South Wales when it comes to 30 by 30. The message we're getting is that it's okay, the Northern Territory and Western Australia will do the heavy lifting, and New South Wales, you know, we've got all those western slopes. They're a bit of a basket case. We don't really need to do it. And what we need to keep going back to every jurisdiction with is that conservation management nationally and internationally, has to be measured at the bioregional level. In other words, that sort of agreed framework where you've got some genuine like for like comparison, it's a nonsense for us to be saying we'll do our conservation in the top end and west of this country. We're not going to worry about it in those heavily depleted bioregions in New South Wales. And in the marine space, let's just remember, we've only got 5 marine bioregions in New South Wales. One of them, Twofold Shelf, doesn't have a single marine protected area. And Sydney has just got that tiny little set of jewels that I talked about, which are, you know, I think 2.2% of the Sydney or the Hawkesbury Shelf bioregion. So we're falling way short now, and we have to be going back and saying 30 by 30 is only meaningful if we're applying it within a bioregional context, and we're not at the moment.
Thank you. And in terms of strategies, Emma, what have you seen work kind of in the global spaces that you're working in, and maybe, you know, in terms of the Caribbean and other places that seem to be doing pretty well?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, in the international sphere, there's now a lot of funding, a lot of focus on ensuring sustainable funding for marine management and for the implementation of marine parks. And that's coming through from many sources, from private philanthropists, from governments. The focus of a lot of that is of obviously small island developing states that I work with. And, you know, Australia shouldn't be needing that funding, but it is interesting that there is significant financing architecture to support conservation. And I think we're missing out on some of the advances in that field and some of the goodwill from significant donors to actually help support enforcement, education, monitoring, all the on the ground work that can be happening to help communities to be sustainable that way.
Yeah, there is that whole thing around how to drive support politically. And I'll go to another question as well, which is kind of on this. Miranda has asked, hey Miranda, thanks for joining us. Why is the fishers lobby so well organised and influential, given fishers are a relatively small group? How do we get around them? Gary, I know we've talked about it, but does anybody else want to jump into that one? Because the politics of fishers in this state is just unbelievable. But as Dane said, I'll go to you in a sec. Most fishers are like, they get it. You protect areas of our oceans, and hey, there's more fish, and there's more fish for future generations if people want to do that. David.
I was just going to say, you make a very good point. With a silent majority, and this is the case with a lot of issues, a silent majority doesn't get heard. That's why we've been working with people like Dane's at Champion, but a few others to put the fishers' point of view. We met with Minister Moriarty, the Minister for Agriculture, a while ago, pushing the fact that she's getting the wrong message. She's getting this radical message from some fishers. That's the wrong message. Most fishers believe in marine conservation and no-take areas, and so we push that to her. So I think that's the way forward. Could be just education as well, but there are a lot of fishers out there, but they don't really speak up, and they're starting to do so now. Dane and others are starting to do that, which is a good move.
Yeah, thank you. And I have to be, you know, reasonably careful with what we say, even in forums like this, because no doubt there, you know, probably people who may have joined tonight who might not be so pro marine conservation as the majority of us are. But there are certainly people within the department that are very, let's say, not conducive to the marine conservation message. I think ministers, you know, getting particularly new ministers when the departments have been under a coalition government for 11 years, 12 years, and, you know, things move quite slowly. I think that is a big factor, and it's also a big reason why we need to get marine conservation moved, marine park management moved to the Environment Department. Like, we've got things, somebody mentioned about shark nets, you know, absolutely. We've got shark nets where, like, you know, Labor has just put them in. This is despite what I hear was happening internally and with the community surveys, was a lot of the advice actually in community surveys was saying, that we'd actually be okay going towards alternatives. So yes, and these are threatened species that the Environment Minister should actually have, first and foremost, have decision-making authority over.
Kate, can I just speak to can I
sure.
just speak to Miranda's question briefly?
Yes.
Like many things, follow the money. Okay, we need to follow the money on this. There's a saying in the fishing industry, lures catch fishermen, not fish. These people consume vast amount of stuff. They put fuel in their boats, they buy fishing rods, they buy fishing lures, they buy line. What is at the top of all of that? It's oil and gas. Okay, these people stand to profit the most, is the head of that chain, the oil and gas industry. They make all these products. DuPont was the first one to build nylon fishing line back in, I think, 1942 or something like that. This is an industry, and the tackle lobby is powerful for that reason. They bring income into the economy. The almighty dollar speaks when it comes to fishing in that respect. So, yeah, that's my answer to that question.
Yeah, thanks, Dane.
Hey, if I could just add as well, I think we actually, it's not really giving them credit, but I think we have to acknowledge that there are some great communicators amongst that small vocal minority in the fishing lobby. You know, there's ABC has a weekly program on fishing. There's regular columns in the Daily Telegraph. There's a number of magazines that actually survived the shift to digital. So they're out there and they're talking to people with loud voices in a way that the conservation movement's often struggled to do.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Good points. Having said that, let's just kind of remember, though, that vast majority of people love our oceans, love the animals, creatures in our oceans. You know, the whole killing of Gus the Groper really shows just how much that kind of big public support is out there. I think we could be, and I'm glad, you know, AMC, SMPA in this space have been great at campaigning for better protection. I think this next year, 2, 3, needs to be the time in New South Wales where we pick up this marine campaign again. I think we got a bit scared because of the backlash from some of the marine campaigns that have happened, that I think the media also plays a big role in kind of fueling this kind of feverish opposition, if you like, on the ground. But it's always contentious. But again, it doesn't have to be as contentious in terms of the way that we do it. I want to go quickly to another question because I think this is a really good one. I think this is the last one we're going to have time for. And I reckon somebody on here, probably David and Gary, will know the answer to this. It's from Alison about the history of Cabbage Tree Bay. You know, what can we as voters and ocean swimmers, divers do to pressure the Labor government to create more sanctuaries like Cabbage Tree Bay? I'm curious to know what factors drove the protection of Cabbage Tree Bay. And I'm just saying this because I feel like Gary or David may know that. Is that a yes from one of you? Otherwise, well, those awkward moments where we don't know.
Actually, Dane, who was right on the spot, may know more about the actual kernel that started the whole thing 20 years or so ago. But obviously, it's a place where there's huge community support and enforcement. And this is the big thing. You can have all these lines on the map, but if no one's enforcing them, people don't follow the rules. And there's I think there's 1 or 2 fisheries officers for the whole Sydney region that are easily avoided. So I think it's the whole community thing. And you know, that's led to really good enforcement. How it started, I wasn't around at that point, so
yeah.
One thing I will mention is that it actually came from first the Manly Environment Centre, and then they managed to get the council to actually champion it. And so council had put together a management plan for Cabbage Tree before it was actually declared, and then they lobbied the state government to declare it. So it was a really grassroots-led campaign, but the critical part of it was that they got council in as, and at the time it was quite a progressive Manly council, and they got council in as a really strong partner.
That's amazing, because that basically allows us to close this off. Those of you who have come to my webinars know I'm very strict about the 1 hour, but local government elections. So we've got to think about where we can next place pressure politically. Local councils, coastal councils actually do have a lot of influence and power around obviously creating those and lobbying for those aquatic reserves. We know that there were some really great coastal councils that were against the implementation, again, of shark nets. So we've got council elections coming up in September this year. If you're part of a local community group or just locally, engaged, and you can speak to your councillors, obviously Greens councillors and coastal councils will run on marine protection issues. I know they're doing great work. Make it an issue if you can locally. Look at the coastal waters in your area and think, okay, are there aquatic reserves here that we could get better protection for, or should we be joining broader campaigns around, for example, a Sydney Marine Park? From my perspective, we've got an exciting marine campaign that we are launching in the next couple of weeks. Just got some good branding back today from the designer. I'm very excited about it. We're going to do stickers and the corflute posters, banners, and I want to be doing our community meetings and kind of town hall meetings, community meetings up and down the coast over the next 6 to 12 months. So I reckon, people are wanting this. They just need to be encouraged, activated, informed. This was the first step from my point of view for a little bit of time in terms of informing people about where everything is up to in terms of marine conservation. And I'll tell you what, the interest has been really, really huge. We will email everybody who attended tonight, and those who didn't, with links to the various campaigns. So I think NPA's probably got one, and Dane has got a petition as well, and we'll link to ours. We'll also keep you informed. So we've got your contacts, and I'm sorry, we've got to go, but thank you so much. Our panelists, can we just yay, and it's a webinar, so no one can clap, but I'm clapping. You're all amazing, and love your work. Thank you so much for what you've done and what you continue to do for marine conservation. And well, I think we'll see a lot more of each other, including everybody that's tuned in over the next months, because I am so furious that Labor is just nowhere on this, and we have to get them activated, and we have to get them concerned. We have to get them scared. No, sorry. We don't have to get them too scared, everybody. If that was too political, Gary and David, and yeah, you got it, right? Okay, everyone. Oh, 8:02. All right. Thanks, everyone, so much for joining, and we'll stay in touch on this important campaign. See ya.